share. Yes. Take this opportunity to provide a very, very big welcome and thank you for being here to this first European Conference on Food System Science. As Roger said, my name is Stine, and I have the pleasure of coordinating the FoSSNet project that is hosting this conference. So I will give you a very, very brief introduction to the FoSSNet project, just to provide a little bit of context as to why we have invited you here today. And then after me, Monica, who's hopefully here somewhere, will introduce you a bit more to the location of Oxford University and also to the conference and the program. At least you see in picture. So FoSSNet is a 4-year project funded under the Horizon Europe, and we are at the moment 1 year into the project, so we have 3 years left. And FoSSNet is short for Food System Science Network. That means that the overarching aim of the project is to establish a network for food system science. And it also thereby means that we see this conference as one out of several steps towards establishing such a network. And thereby that through this conference, you are all invited to be engaged and continue to be members of such a network for food system science. So it is, of course, then fair to ask why. Why do we think it's a good idea to establish such a network for food system science? And on the very, very basic level, this builds on the premise that, first of all, we do need changes in the way the food system is functioning, and that knowledge and innovation has a significant role to play in such a transformation. But it also builds on the basic understanding that the current knowledge and innovation system is limited in its potential to support such transformative change. So we see troubles or challenges related to fragmented knowledge contributions and challenges related to the research practice gap. And then, of course, this idea of building a network for food system science also builds on an understanding that food system science can be part of the solution to some of these challenges. So in recent years, the idea of a food systems perspective has really been gaining momentum because it offers holistic perspectives or holistic insights into the many complexities that characterizes our food system. But at the same time, there also seems to be a lack of clarity as to what food system science actually is, and also of how it links with other disciplines and other forms of knowledge. So within that context, we sort of argue within the FoSSNet project that now is a really good time to come together around the field of food system science and take steps towards maybe even talking about a consolidation of food system science as an academic field. But also that in that process, it is key to provide spaces for reflexivity where we can raise and discuss critical questions also. If we talk about food system science as an interdisciplinary field, then how do we actually succeed in moving between an additive approach to knowledge integration? How do we actually constructively use some of the tensions that can also arise when we meet across diverging epistemologies, values, and identities? So the FoSSNet project is trying to establish exactly such spaces where we can come together in what we term an inclusive pan-European interdisciplinary network for food system science. And in the project, and thereby also as part of this conference, we are addressing, well, a range of different questions. But the first of these questions regards the mere sort of idea of what is actually food system science. So even though, and as I think we will hear later today, there is of course a longer history to the concept of food system science, but at the same time we also see it being used in so many different contexts and so many different ways at the moment that there might be a risk that this turns into just another empty buzzword. So we need to discuss what we actually mean by food system science, and thereby also what we do not mean. So this will be framing the discussions that we're going to have with you later this afternoon. Then another question that we're also addressing in the project is related to the building of such a network. So if we want to build an academic network for food system science, it is really important to talk about how do we build a governance structure and how do we build a value proposition that actually makes such a network relevant, both to the people in it, but also to the people collaborating and gaining from such a network. And within the project, we're of course taking many steps to try to answer such questions. And what we're doing at the moment is trying to understand the existing landscapes of food system science and food systems education. And this is also one of the surveys that you have already received and I hope also answered. Otherwise, you still have the chance to do so. Then another of these sort of overarching questions that we are addressing and trying to raise through the FoSSNet project is related to the issue of inclusivity. So we know that the food system itself is characterized by a lot of inequalities, and we also know that academia, broadly, beyond the field of agri-food, is characterized by a lot of power dynamics and a lot of exclusion mechanisms. That means that it is easier for some forms of knowledge and some kinds of identities to gain influence and to build influential careers in academia. And we argue that it is really important that we understand how these dynamics play out in the field of food system science, of course, with the aim of hopefully building a more inclusive field. And then the last of these sort of overarching questions that we are trying to address within the project, and also, again, inviting for a dialogue about, relates to how to build strong relations between practice and research with the aim of supporting food system transformation. And in the project, we are addressing this from at least from two different perspectives. So on the one hand, we are aiming to contribute with methodologies to build inclusive, multi-actor, transdisciplinary, place-based processes to identify, on the one hand, research needs, but also to produce collaborative answers to these research needs. And then from a different angle, we're also addressing the relations between practice and research through education. So how to build educational structures and educational components that actually builds capabilities among food system practitioners that enables them to navigate, support, and drive food system change. So I just got the 1 minute sign, and it fits quite nicely. These are some of the overarching questions that we're trying to address in the project. And as I said, we are really hoping to have, through the project, have a dialogue with with all of you and a broader network. So this will be framing a lot of the discussions that we're going to have in the conference, both this conference, but also in future events. And with that, I would like to see Monica. Oh, you're there. Right. So Monica will introduce you a bit more to Oxford and to the conference.
Yeah, thank you. Hello, everyone. Sorry, this is not. There we go. Yes. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Oxford. My name is Monica Zurich. I'm the lead of the Food System Transformation Group in the Environmental Change Institute, and I'm working here with John and Roger and a whole bunch of colleagues from the Institute to host you here in Oxford. We are also the lead of Work Package 1 that works on the conceptual framework and science definition, and also how do we kind of define then a food system in practice. Later building on how do we define the EU food system and describe it basically based on our work. But yes, what we wanted to discuss with you here in Oxford in the first conference was really a lot of these concepts and bring the community together around it. So we are very happy that you made the way, and whoever has some time later on in the evening can walk around and see some of the sites of Oxford. So here is what we really want to do with you, and Stina already said a little bit about this. We want to really initiate and establish the food system science network across Europe to bring a lot of you basically together into this network that hopefully over the course of the next few years can really be the motor of food systems thinking and food system science across Europe. So what we really need to do for that is clarify the key concepts, and this is what this conference is about. and take stock of where do we sit as a research field based on these definitions and on these concepts. Where does the food system science research field sit here in Europe as much as globally, so that we also can join together with other people around the globe eventually to think about, what do we call food system science versus maybe agricultural science or consumer research or other forms of science that address food system issues. So that's one of the things we want to sort out. We also want to really explore the role of food system science in helping with the transformation conversation, and to start strategizing really actions and refine the FoSSNet proposition towards basically the science community as well as the practitioners to really establish this whole network. So therefore, here is the overall program of what we wanted to do with you today. So today is about really looking into the concepts. We developed a conceptual framework. We developed a definition of food system science that we want to get your feedback on, and basically in working groups kind of rework this so that we as a community say, here is something that we as a community can stand behind in terms of defining food system science. Tomorrow, then, we will start to the network development based on these definitions. There's, again, work that has happened in the project that we want to get your input on in terms of assessing the state of food system science, but then also really thinking about what's the role of food system science in the food system transformation debate that's going on across the globe. So, again, we will have a very set number of talks that then help us to go into discussion groups basically over the course of the day to really work this through with everyone. And then the last day is really about thinking about actions to really establish the science network. So how do we want to build the network? Again, there's ideas from the projects, and we want to get your feedback on where do we go from here. And that basically means we want you to help us as a whole community to really work with you on establishing the network, on defining what the network is all about, getting your feedback, getting your input, to really build the network jointly inclusive, as Tina was saying, across the different views that might exist in the community and across the different ideas that also practitioners bring to the table. So here we are mainly academics, but we also have quite a number of people working in the ministries or at the commission or at industry partners, and we really want to make sure that it also works for the practitioners right from the start. So this is not just a science exercise. So that is all I have to say on kind of that particular conference here. So we're very pleased that you're joining us here in Oxford. And as I say, hopefully you will enjoy the discussions and the conference. And again, we're here to be challenged. So we're really looking forward to a number of hopefully quite interesting days together with you. That's it from my side. I would now like to invite our first speaker, Niels Hallberg from the Aarhus University, to come. So Niels is professor, let me just say this right. Niels is professor at the University of Aarhus and is doing research in agroecology, food systems, organic agriculture, environmental assessments of food system. He's also the Danish representative on the SCA EU initiative. So Niels, over to you. Thanks very much for coming.
Thank you. Both mics working, or was okay, good. So well, thanks for inviting me in last minute, because the commission couldn't be here to tell how important this initiative is. Having heard the two splendid, very good first presentations, I'm sure you really need me, but nevertheless, I'll give it a try. But I'll make it a disclaimer first, because I will not give a lecture on food systems. Other people in this room who will follow me are a lot more capable of doing that. I'm saying it because there will be some illustrations that may suggest that I think I'm really clever on food systems, but I'm really not, which is basically why I really support an initiative that could do what Monica just suggested, to bring us into a more common grounds and give us a space where we can really nerd a bit more into that. And so I'll give you a few observations on what I've experienced since I started myself, being inspired by some of the people in this room, and also starting from life cycle assessments, which I've developed since the year 2000. And I think that I can't read in the slides. I may just go to the slides instead. But how do I go down here? Is that like this? So I'll speak partly on behalf of the SCAR Food Systems Group, which I helped initiate quite some years ago, and a lot of personal observations. So we started the SCAR Food Systems Group quite some years ago. We are into the third mandate period now, from 23 to 27. It's basically a group supporting the overall SCAR, which has as the main merit to convey the member states' research and innovation needs in different areas to the Commission's programs, to DG Research. And so we do it on the food systems, and it actually did start more, I think, as an alternative to all the agriculture, primary production-based research and innovation. So we're supposed to focus more on the processing and so on. So, but we kind of insisted of using the food systems in a more holistic term. In our third mandate period, we have promised to talk about or go more into seeing if food systems transition, resilience, etc., are useful concepts, and where do we need more research into that. When we started, food systems already becoming a buzzword. And what we did in the beginning was that we said, is it actually a useful term for research? Can we do research under the term food systems meaningfully? Does it exist? And so we hired a small group of experts. One of them is supposed to be here. I don't know if Thomas arrived, and to provide a kind of a state-of-art synthesis of what studies had already used the food systems approach, and to see if that could give input to the formulation of knowledge needs for easy research and innovation programs. And there was a very thorough methodology behind this, and it could be a whole lecture in itself. But the main points were that yes, there are good experiences from the literature of understanding and acting with the food systems view. We need that in the light of these multifaceted challenges of many stakeholders. And we need that to identify relationships and interdependencies and outcomes. And we'll come back a bit to that. And basically to grasp the complexity. So we took that further in the group, in the SCAR Food Systems Group, and developed our own kind of small policy brief on that, where we said that we need on the methodologies more credible methodologies and ways of do feasible analysis of food systems, including, for example, defining the borders, and how to operationalize in methodology and praxis the distinction between interdependencies between different scales, etc., identification of logins, barriers for change, etc., etc. So how to speed up the learning and create a community of practice was already something we discussed at the time. And can we provide an experimental space for practitioners? And I think one of my personal observations is that maybe starting with Food 2030, even before this, and other national programs, there's been a lot of food systems labs a lot of local initiatives that claim they use the food systems to improve how local food could contribute to a hospital's canteen and so on. All very good constructive projects, and they might have been inspired, but they're very hard to learn from each other. I've tried many times to ask people engaged in that to say, but from a food systems perspective, what can I learn that can be useful in the next? What did you learn about the interactions, interdependencies, the feedback loops, and so on a more principle level? And we are still not really there where we can do that. So that's one of the areas I think we should look into. A more structured and rigid use of methodological concepts. And that's what we also said the focus should be at the time. It could be more consumer and citizen-centered, but now there is a lot of research on that. And again, it's really hard to see how that fits into a systems methodology. So we also developed one of these conceptual models. They come in bundles, and this one is no more brilliant than many others, I can say, because I draw it up. It's very rather primitive and sketchy. On the other hand, it actually helped the group, the SCAR Food Systems Group and others we communicated to take seriously why you need to go from a value chain approach to a food system. To just illustrate, there are these complexities, which is perhaps defined as the number of feedback loops, the interactions between the physical monetary flows and the compartments, etc. And there is interdependencies in the outcomes. And then another point is to say, classical system theory. Don't think that you can go out and see the system. The system is not there. That's a methodology we put, and that's why all the models are so different. This one is made by an agronomist, so it's more like based on the elements you can see and feel. If you ask the sociologist, it will focus a lot more on drivings and transformations and things like that, which I find hard to understand, honestly, which is again an argument for why we need this better network to really go in behind such models. And this is supported also by a parallel synthesis like that was developed by Brouwer et al. That, and I'll go very quickly here, but because you might know it, but I think it fits nicely into. I haven't seen all these questions solved yet that Brouwer et al. Mentioned, but again, I may be ignorant. I hope I am to stuff that people in this room have done already. But they kind of identified that there were mostly descriptive food systems research with these four different angles. I'm not going to read them aloud. And that little focus has been on the interactions between the stakeholders, the elements in the system, and the trade-offs in the outcomes, especially when the outcomes are interdependent, as I showed before. So we should focus more on the consumer choices and diets, insights and governance mechanisms, usefulness of the approach for innovations, transformative pathways, etc., etc. I think some of these issues have gained more interest, but again, my postulate is that it is sometimes with a lack of real appreciation of decades of system theory and cybernetics that might actually make it more useful in the long run, more complicated to do in the short run. Now, I'm not going to repeat on the left-hand side here all these aspects that we need to take more seriously in our methodologies. Just say that this is also confirmed by the SAPIR Science Policy Report. They even add to this the nice terms of self-evolving and dynamic and non-linear relationships and so on, which are very important probably in food systems, but seldomly also with methodological rigor analyzed and described. So a final point on the systems models is also what I've learned from Des Moines and other systems people from the old days, is that we should be aware and not forget that while it's very easy to choose, at least for an agronomist like me, an ontological, so-called ontological systems understanding. That's basically the primitive picture I did there. What does it consist of? Easy to put up the boxes and some arrows. Now this is my nice system. What constitutes the system? But more important is actually, how does it function? And there you need to understand the flows and the feedback loops. And that's the hard point, isn't it? And so the synergies, etc. And then if you want to really see and follow what is now called the sustainable food systems transition, you need systems methodology from the what he calls historical or genetic perspective. Why did the system evolve into what it is now, and how can it evolve, how can it develop further? And that's a really hard. And then we have this transition theories and so on becoming fashionable with the niche to dominant regimes and whatever it's called. I like to see that put into a real food systems perspective. And I hope I'm wrong. I hope some of you over the next days will say, Niels, here it is. It's already done. I'll be happy when I go home. I perhaps think that it's something we need to put on the agenda for our common community. I'll skip this one. It's just another way of saying the same, except perhaps in the blue that I think some people, I've seen reviews also of drivers of food systems, and very nice argumentation for why this is a stronger driver than that, but never linked into a precise description of a stock and flow or what and feedback loops of a system theory. Adaptive behavior, the same. And my favorite term is the leverage points that I learned from Donella Meadows and her 12 list of 12 categories of leverage points. And I'm really eager, and the civil servants in policy that I work with on this, they are waiting for us to point better at and have a better methodological rigor to point at leverage points and understand them. So coming to an end, why do I see then a use of this food systems methodology and the network here? It's for research calls and projects. We did, and I'll talk briefly about that tomorrow, we did work already in FoodPath with a funders forum of funding bodies across Europe to try to convince them that the calls on the future foods, the partnership, should actually include a requirement for every project to have a food systems thinking behind, not to cover necessarily a whole food system, but to know where they are and to argue why their project would be relevant. They did it, let's say, halfway. They're quite interested. There are innovation programs, EIT Food, the Food Kick. That allows me 30 minutes in my own timekeeping. Oh, that's all right. That'll be enough. So the Food Kick talks about food systems. I was part of drafting those strategies, and they have focus points and so on, but they don't have a clue. I'm being a bit provocative. I've said it also there. When they allocate the funding for the project, it is not from a food systems perspective. It is because here is a nice, promising, commercially available innovation, which is fine. So we may not always use food systems in innovation program, but if we claim to do, it kind of could be helpful to have a clear idea. The same in science advice, and that's actually my main background for the last 10, 12 years, is to coordinate science advice to our ministries. They are so eager to have science advice from a food systems perspective. And we also talk about food systems observatory. Everybody talks about that. The JRC has a new with the indicators, and we did a review of almost all there is. So many fantastic data handling processes and indicators, and I'm very impressed. They come up with the indicators across my whole drawing of a food system, but none of them explains interactions, feedback loops, anything which we need to understand a system, okay? So from the perspective of future foods, we really need this development. And okay, this is already, I'm talking about the science advice. So I'll skip this one and just say that there are also very inspirational things going on in this country where they talk about food systems and healthier diets and so on. And from reading that material, yeah, actually this NGO-supported report is one that comes closer. They really define why there are lock-ins to changing the industrial centralized food system into more diverse and so on. So I was and that's why I say I'm not talking as an academic to academics that we need this nerdy community. I really support what you said. It should be open from the beginning because we have clever people in industry, in NGOs, in civil servants who are also thinking and need to learn and develop the food systems methodology. So thank you for the book.
Thank you so much, Niels. That was, I think, a great kickoff to the conference already, because you opened a lot of really big questions that we are starting to grappling with, but that we're really trying to sort out over the conference. The question of metrics, the question of feedbacks, how do we frame things? So to say, whose knowledge is part of all of this? We have invited, as another kind of kick-off speaker for this first session, Erik Matthijs from Leuven. He's professor of agriculture and resource economics at the University of Leuven and has been working on food systems as a science over the last 20 years at least, together with John, our fearless leader here in Oxford. And he works today a lot on practices and metrics and policies also for fostering food system change. It's a whole question of how do we use all of this really for incentivizing change, and in which direction, your question of leverage points, how do we identify this? And is therefore also very interested in the question of finance around change, true cost accounting, and the overall protein transition. So over to you, Erik, to kind of kick us off for our afternoon discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Monica. Good afternoon. And it's a big honor to really kick off this really great conference, which I really agree with Niels. Thank you, Niels, for this great introduction, because you will see that many of the messages that I will relay are basically the same, but I was asked to do it from a historical point of view. Just as a side note, I was also one of the contributors to that SAPEA report on sustainable food systems. That comes actually with an anecdote, because I was an added author. And I will tell you the anecdote in the break if you want. And I was the chair of the second SAPEA report on sustainable food consumption as well. So these are my accolades in the food system, my recent accolades in the food system literature, if you like. Okay, so the history of food system science. What do you do these days to start? I mean, I got the request, 4 weeks ago, John? 3 weeks ago? Not so long ago. A WhatsApp message. It's like, oh no. So what do you do in these stressed times? Well, this is my first slide. You ask an LLM, right? A large language model, right? I asked actually ChatGPT. He said, what are the origins of food system science? Oh, well, food system science is an interdisciplinary field, emerged from multiple academic traditions, policy discussions, practical needs, address complexities of food production, distribution, consumption, and sustainability, etc., etc. And here are some of the intellectual and historical developments. There it is. This is what ChatGPT produced, right? A historical overview. As you can see, it started with system science, ecology, interesting. So we have, of course, good old von Bertalanffy, but also Odum. Never heard of Elton. Maybe interesting to look up. It's from ecology, food chains. He probably misunderstood. Misunderstood. What chains means. We brought it back from ecology. Interestingly, I'm an agricultural economist, and the second wave, he refers to the Green Revolution. I was quite surprised by that. Don't really link Green Revolution to food systems, right? And then you have Sense approach, the World Food Summit, the food security definitions and stuff like that. And then the true rise of food systems thinking in the 90s and the 2000s with the IPCC, with the agroecology movement, to come now at the true institutionalization of food system science with FAO, CG system, UNEP, the Sustainable Development Goals, etc., etc. Yeah. So this is the summary produced by ChatGPT. And then I asked him, because he can get into a dialogue with it, right? Which is really interesting. Ask him, what about Donella Meadows, right? I asked him, and I also asked him, what about Polly Erickson, right? It's like, oh, yes, great point. She's a key figure in food system science, and this is why, she had this 2008 paper, very important. And this is the reason I didn't really pick her up in the beginning, is because my initial response was on historical and foundational figures, but her work is really crucial for modern food system science. And thanks for bringing her up. Very thankful. She's one of the most important voices in contemporary food systems research, and her frameworks are widely used today in policy and academic discussions. Now, for time reasons, I also asked for John Ingram. I'll show you, because I also asked for myself, what did Eric Mattes, me, contribute to food system science? Oh, he's a leading researcher, thank you, in food system transformation, blah, blah, blah. His work on transitioning, basically the introduction that Monica gave. He's a key figure, blah, 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 blah. But then I told him, you're too generous. Okay, fair enough. Let's take a more critical approach. He's not a foundational thinker at all, not a major theorist. He's policy-oriented, but not very practical. He likes deep engagement with the implementation. Ivory tower kind of guy, probably. His circular economy ideas are really, not unique, and his technology and innovation views could be more critical. It's like, oh. So final verdict, a solid contributor, blah, 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 but not a founding father. Would you agree with this more measured assessment? It's like, yeah. And then interesting. Glad that we're on the same page, smiley. If you're looking for more critical takes, please let me know. Sometimes these fields are full of buzzwords and optimistic visions, but the real challenge is implementation and power dynamics. Always to keep a sharp, skeptical mind. I was quite amazed by that, right? This is ChatGPT. And that was actually the main message that Niels was saying. Actually, that will also be part of this was my prelude, the real prelude. This is what I would like to stress, two elements. One is what I call the backbone of food systems. We've seen it in Niels's figure. He actually referred to, how we can move from value chain to food systems. But what is the backbone? How do we always draw food systems? Always the same. And I will come back to that, because indeed it's the genetics of our food systems thinking. It's path dependency that we should actually reflect upon. And then I'll talk about the layers that, if you accept my metaphor of the backbone, the layers that make the flesh to the bone, that relates to the mechanics of the food system. That's the feedback loops and the stuff that we're hearing about, the multiple perspectives. But I think something that really, I think also to you as a community is important is the emancipatory aspects of it. And then I'll try to conclude with some general principles. This is what I mean with the backbone. Here it is. I copy-pasted it from the next presentation, which of course you recognize from the deliverable. It's farmers to the left, consumers to the right. Sounds like a start of a dance. Processing, retailing in the middle. This is kind of still linear depiction, which is still central to most of our food systems depictions, and from left to right. Which of course comes from, the material flow of food, of goods. Some call it actually feedstock, biomass, timber, whatever, services from producers to consumers. Comes back from the origin where we were both producers and consumers, and then you had the rise of middlemen performing activities, collecting, transporting, repackaging, selling, etc., etc. And of course, now we are talking about the fact that they have too much power. Now, the earliest paper I could find that describes this is actually from 1970 in the American Economic Review, top journal in economics. And he called that, this guy Weld called that the marketing functions. It's basically the functional approach to a food system. And it's very much ingrained in, as I said, I'm an agricultural economist, so I teach agronomy students, agricultural students. is very much ingrained in our thinking, this functional approach, which basically says that this, as you can see, source any agricultural marketing or agribusiness handbook, especially the American ones. If you take it, it is all going to be there. This is how we agricultural economists think about food systems. Yeah, we have to satisfy the utility of a consumer, which means that we have to, bring products in the right form at the right place at the right time to the possession of the consumers. This is the purpose of the food system, as seen by us agricultural economists. There's some barriers to consumer satisfaction, and that's why we need these marketing functions, which are like processing, storage, transportation, but also to facilitate those standardization, finance, etc., etc. Yeah. So you could say the definition here is that the food system is a set of activities performed by business actors, specialized business actors, carrying out a set of functions in order to overcome a set of barriers to fulfill consumer satisfaction. And I would argue that this is still the backbone of how we mostly draw food systems. And I think we should reflect on it. I don't say that we should change it, but we at least should reflect on it and look at what the consequences of that are. And actually, this paper in 1969 in the Journal of Marketing, top journal in marketing, already called for an integrated approach, marrying the functional view and the systems view. And by the way, if you take a contemporary marketing handbook, you will not find the functional approach anymore. It's considered old-fashioned by non-food marketeers, but in the food system, it's still really very much basic thinking of food systems. Yeah. So what about this one, for example? This is from from Nourish Life. I could have also taken the FAO wheel for that matter. Where it's still there. You can see the supply chain there, the left, the economic system, but also, the sun is actually there. Isn't the sun, the real backbone of our food system? Isn't it photosynthesis? Is that not really the backbone, right? Shouldn't that be in our graph? So the biological system, the inputs taken from a large point of view, but really consumers in the middle, right? With a political system, social system, health system, family, a completely different way of looking at things. But of course, as most of you are social scientists, it also influences the way we think of solutions and problems. So should we revisit the backbone or not? Because I think there is really a path dependency in how we think about this basic structure. And we should at least think of what that means and how we can mitigate or accommodate it. Okay, so let me move to the layers. And here I had hoped that Gerald was going to be here, but I was told that he couldn't make it because I really drawn on his on a chapter he wrote on systems thinking for evaluation, in which we talked about the three waves of systems thinking, which is basically hard systems, soft systems, and more integrated approach. Throughout the last 50 years, and I've used that to kind of rather than talk about waves, historical waves, aren't these kind of layers or principles that food systems approaches should comply to? This is how I interpret it. And actually, I was inspired by this set of two very interesting papers. Have you ever seen them? Please do read them. These are written by Maria Bustamante and co-authors, and you will probably recognize Lauren Baker from GAIN as a co-author, because they basically evaluated, according to a set of principles, pretty much the same set of food system conceptual models that actually also in the FoSSNet project have been evaluated. And that is basically three sets of principles. To what extent are they really holistic, systemic? To what extent are they dynamic, looking at changes? And to what extent are they actually looking at how actors are framing these systems, basically at agency? And what's really interesting is these results. You can see that most of these, only 3% of the models that they looked at, I think they looked at 24 of them, so it's going to be one of them, was not systemic. But what's more importantly, 42% of these models were not really, the principle of dynamics was even absent. And also, when you look at the acknowledgement of the role of agents, 38% of those didn't even acknowledge that agents actually are in a food system. Yeah, so quite interesting results. The raw data was not supplementary material, so I couldn't, pinpoint it to the exact. I'm now looking at some of you who may co-author some of these models, but you can of course send an email to the authors for the original data. Yeah. So the first layer, the hard systems thinking, indeed, as Niels has brought up, several of these elements is, of course, rooted in general systems theory, and that posits that systems are open, nested hierarchies. The nestedness is also something that we are struggling with, right? So to the extent to which local systems are embedded in regional and national and global systems, they're characterized, as Niels was saying, by feedbacks, which comes from cybernetics and multiple interactions in time, in space, leading to emergent phenomena. And of course, one of the problems of complexity is that our mind is not well equipped of capturing these mechanics. We are thinking very linearly. We are incapable of thinking in terms of feedback loops and exponential and balancing and stuff like that. We need models for that. So enter magnets, enter globium, enter impacts, enter these Capri, the hardcore models of that we use to model our food system. But of course, the first question that you can ask yourself is to what extent they're actually already able to capture these elements. That's one thing. But anyway, that's what I would like to refer to as the first layer, the mechanics, the hard systems. This is also in the beginning of system science, where most of the developments were. And then you have this second layer. The criticism to that is, well, what are the people? What are the different perspectives? What about subjective, intersubjective insight of stakeholders? We did some work for SCAR, actually, SCAR Foresight number 3, where we looked at, how to the extent to which these models actually represent a dominant logic, a dominant narrative. And so this would call for an approach that emphasizes dialogue, the intersubjective construction of understanding. So basically, this is a constructivist layer on top of the more positivist layer, if you like. And with an emphasis on acknowledgement, mutual appreciation, reconciliation of different perspectives. But the point is, this is not enough, right? It's not enough to say, okay, I hear what you're saying, thank you. Okay, so let's and not do anything with it. And I think this action element is probably the most important, this emancipatory element, this third layer, which the criticisms to this more constructivist way of looking at things is, to what extent are power imbalances and conflict taken into account. This dominant narrative, which basically means, and still most of us are still guilty of that dominant narrative, where we say, global population will rise with that percentage, so we need to produce more food, so productivity needs to increase, so technology needs to be mobilized, so capital markets need to be, and this is still, I think, very much the dominant narrative, although since the planetary boundary sufficiency has kicked in. So to what extent should that be linked to the backbone? I think our conceptual models should have the ability to overcome indeed polarization, but especially to move to action. Now here I'm quoting from the Bustamante paper that says, defining, questioning, and reflecting on boundaries requires careful consideration of the links between power relations, perspective prioritization, boundary decisions, and their ethical and practical implications. I see here a very nice link to Lincoln and Guba's work. I'm sure you all know Lincoln and Guba's work, most cited work on qualitative research there is, I think. Mostly known for the middle column, their definition of what quality means in qualitative research, but they also developed these, what they call expanded criteria of authenticity, in which research should also be fair. So that's the second layer, right? The different viewpoints have been represented fairly. It should help members to better understand their environment. It should help them to appreciate other perspectives in their milieu. Okay. But then I find the most interesting what they call catalytic authenticity. What we do should actually help them to engage in action and improve their livelihoods. That's the catalytic aspect that also should be part, I think, of our conceptual modeling. It also corresponds, I don't know what you know, this kind of the forms of complexity. Took this from Adam Kay. Where this first layer talks about dynamic complexity, the second layer about social complexity, and the third layer about generative complexity. Now, I'm out of time, I would like to offer you two pieces of thoughts, two controversial examples. One is, just as a reflection, and I don't know whether you remember the quantitative food system modeling done by an institution well represented here today. Sorry, Tom. to evaluate the EU farms to fork strategy, and that basically said if you go ahead with the farm to fork strategy, food security in the world will deteriorate, right? It was a study financed by CropLife. Very controversial, right? The use of food systems models in a quantitative way, in layer 1. But what about layers 2 and 3? Yeah, there was a big controversy. Anecdote number 2, you can ask me in the. I also know the story from the inside. So has this clash of truths, because that's what's really happening, been truly emancipatory? Have we now come up with a vision that is actually better? Probably not, even worse. And maybe even more controversial, because most of you are probably familiar with the concept of living labs. Niels already alluded to them. Are they true systemic, pluralistic, so layer 1, layer 2, emancipatory sandboxes? It's a word that's actually in our vision of the Commission for Social Innovations. Or are they just box-checking devices to get the money, right? I see actually, I think it's a continuum, and I see everything on the continuum, to be honest. Yeah. So 2 maybe controversial examples where I think, where does food system science contribute? Where does it kick in? Where can it improve? Yeah. And then it gives rise to this kind of maybe 3 layers: the dynamic complexity, the systemic nature, but also the participatory element, truly participatory, and what does representation really mean, and how do you do that? It's not so straightforward. And then especially this catalytic element. Does it really make a difference, basically? So my concluding remarks: what are the implications of the path-dependent way of looking at the mostly economic backbone of food system depictions? And secondly, how can we make sure that our conceptual food system frameworks are capturing not only the dynamic complexity, but also the social complexity, and especially also the generative complexity, linking up to the leverage points probably, right? But leverage points that really matter, that are not, again, imaginations of us researchers, true cost accounting, that's what you should do. But what does that really mean in practice? What does this actually mean for people? And that's what I think should be the focus of our work. Thank you.
Eric, thank you so much. I think you open up a lot of boxes for us. Exactly what we needed to really get us started to think about, what are the different ways of conceptualizing what a food system is, and that historical look back on what we have built in order to come up with the concepts and what it means for the future in terms of these questions. I think that was really helpful. I want to hand over to John Ingram now from the Food System Group here in Oxford to lead us into the group work that we have been doing or designing to kind of get all the discussions kickstarted. So we want to show you what we have so far in the project, and we really hope that you can discuss and take that apart in the rest of the afternoon and give us your input about what do we think is the right conceptual framework that we need across the European network, and what do we call food system science in comparison to maybe other ways of framing what we do in the food system. So over to John.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Monica. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and it's really wonderful to welcome you to Oxford, and hope we're having an interesting and fun 2 or 3 days together. I feel daunted by having just listened to those 2 talks. So what I have to present is going to be very mundane, I fear, compared to what you've been exposed to so far. But as background, it's absolutely crucial. And as we go through the work groups this afternoon and for the rest of the conference, really hang on to what we've been hearing already and challenge ourselves always. We are going to look at a diagram emerge. You could critique it, particularly with Eric's analysis. We've done a lot of work thinking about what food system frameworks really mean. What are they for? What are they good for? What are they not good for? How do they channel the mind? How do they open up the mind? And all those sorts of things. So let's see how we get on. Defining food system science, session 1. Goals of session 1. I've got to present the conceptual food system framework and the definition. We want to discuss and modify it, and we're aiming to reach some sort of consensus, so that as a project, we can move forward together without constantly going back to the thing, well, what do you mean by that? And I don't like that word and all that sort of stuff. So let's see where we got to. why do we need it? A number of reasons. Firstly, we wanted it to help guide the project and the broader community of collaborators in understanding what we're talking about, describing the elements of the system together with its boundaries. And I was really pleased that you ended up near the end of the talk on this business about boundaries, because that's going to be really important. So help set a boundary for our work, agree kind of what's in and what's out. We'll look at that, which will run across all the work packages. To help communicate to a broader community, what do we mean when we're talking about food systems? And then fourth, really for helping with the research and the teaching and the learning. A lot of us are involved working with students. How do we project a joint message which isn't conflicting as we talk with different communities? And really to think about the potential intervention points. Going back to Donnell, the notion of how do we bring about change in what we're calling the food system, so that we are delivering better food system outcomes. So, what do we consider? The purpose. What should be the purpose of it, internally and externally? How do we frame it? What are the worldviews? How do we capture each other's perspectives and the like? And of course, the boundary. What should be included? Where do we say enough? What do we do then? So we started off by looking at 24 or 28 or so frameworks. These have been identified in analysis by Kirsten Kuhl's et al., which was one of the deliverables in the Foster project, one of the sister projects of this one, using these key terms. We looked at further literature. We broadened the scope out a bit. We identified another half a dozen that were strictly relevant to our study. And overall, we based the conceptual framework on that, but also two of the well-known diagrams which are in the literature. Foresight for Food has developed this diagram. You can see many of the key aspects. That's the slice that Eric grabbed is coming straight out of that slide. Again, you can say good or bad, but at least it has some feedback loops in it. But then it also identifies the outcomes. It identifies the drivers. Very important. It notes the feedback, and it recognizes nested systems in human and natural systems. So there. Now that was designed for a purpose, to help develop the foresight world, the foresight work. Colleagues in FAO basically took that and unpacked it a bit to make it a bit more clear what we meant by the drivers on the left, and these numbers in boxes refer to sections in the report that this came from. So there is a big report about drivers. You'll note on the right there aren't any numbers because they weren't discussing the outcomes in anything like the same way. What are we interested in? Personally, I'm interested in the food system outcomes. I think most people in the world are. But how are they delivered? Who benefits, et cetera, and what are the controls on that? So again, note the feedback. So what did we do? Well, we started with the famous, major activities in the middle, but we also noted this notion of what's called the food environment, recognizing that the food environment, the influences around us as society get stronger as you go from the left to the right. And so there's a big literature around food environment and all of that. We recognize that we're working within an institutional environment and supporting services which allow all that machinery to happen. We then thought, what are the immediate drivers and things of interest that will affect the way those activities happen? You can see some words down there: prices, policy and governance, obviously. We then thought about, what's the nature of the social and economic system within which that is working? And we've got some of the other keywords down here, noting cultural heritage from the bottom up, going up through knowledge systems to demographics. So a wide range of drivers there. And then, of course, we thought about the environmental system within which the whole thing operates, and recognizing that the drivers, they're not independent as you go along from the different colored boxes. They build up and they interact. And it's really important to recognize that it's the net result of the drivers that is affecting the food system and the influences, rather than necessarily one of them alone. At any one time, one driver might be particularly powerful, but generally they're all there. So then we start thinking about the outcomes. We bundled some points together here. Note equity and fairness was very much in the discussion. Cultural heritage and community was also noted. And again, the outcomes give rise environmental condition. So that's essentially what's going on. We then added the feedbacks, noting that the feedbacks from all of the independent outcomes, individual outcomes, feedback in their own way to affect all the drivers, and around we go. So first thing to note is we've got a system within a system, because in the heart of the diagram we have an agricultural system, or we have a processing system, or we have what we might call the food system in a linear sense, but that's working within these other nested systems. So that's what's going on. Right. So what I'm going to do now is, this was all written up as a deliverable from the FoSSNet project. That's available for you to study, and all the background and all the rest of it. So just pause for a minute before we go on to the next bit. Are there any questions for clarification? Not to debate, but because when we go into the working groups, we've all got to be thinking the same way about what the task is. Is everybody happy so far? Yes, please.
You put the feedbacks outside the system. There may be what you could call the big wheel. So long-term change.
Okay.
But inside, you don't mention feedbacks, but should I understand the errors there as recognizing that there are short-term feedbacks within the within that core activity?
Sure. Maybe these arrows here are representing the feedbacks within, yes. And so this is why these are double-headed arrows. In the earlier diagram, they were single.
Yeah.
And so that's an important point. Yes, please, just a quick clarifications.
I'm wondering why you don't identify externalities specifically.
Why we don't identify externalities specifically. An example being?
Massive NCDs, deaths, and so on, cost to the NHS, to the health services. Of the food system,
good.
Climate change.
Right.
You have some of those on the left-hand side. Drives.
Excellent point.
They're things that seem to be largely ignored by the food system.
Very good point. So that's a boundary issue. What have we decided to include? This is what we're going to be working on in a moment. So that's really good. Any quick clarification?
Just a reflection on question that it seems that there is also the drivers and the outcomes, especially for the environmental system, is more or less the same. It's just different words. Right? So you have climate conditions that affect the system, but then it actually also leads to climate.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, just got it.
It'll be the same maybe for the social.
Understood. I got it. Yeah. Just for the benefit of the
economic system is affecting the food system.
Yeah, sure. Well, just for the benefit of the people online, the question is, the point was noting that we've got very similar words on the left and the right. They're all in the same coloured box. This is the great challenge in discussing the feedback. When does the feedback become a driver? And around we go. This is the nature of the dynamic system. But one last point, if just for clarification.
So you have flows between actors in the value chain. So why do you put transport outside them?
Why? The question is, why is the transporters outside the
Value chain.
Well, I think it's a graphical error. The point is the transport is meant to be along all of that stuff. It all requires transport. Okay, well, I think we should move on. But these are the sorts of things that we're hoping to tease out in the breakout groups in a moment, and then we can begin to enrich it. All three are very valuable points. So thanks for that. So then we go on to this famous definition. Oh my goodness. So from the proposal, this was written in the proposal, and it was part of the proposal and got the money. You can read it through. I won't read it through, but there's a really sensible bundle of words there, and that's where we started. As the project got going, Work Package 1, which I'm involved in, Work Package 2, started to debate this. Is this actually the best set of words? So what do we consider in thinking about a revision? We drew on the conceptual framework to start with, the boundary that we had on the diagram, noting that it's wanting in a variety of ways. We drew on Sussvan's project and other European projects and national projects we've all been involved in on the framing, asking specifically, how the system as a whole works within the boundary, rather than the science about parts of the system. And that was a really important point. So many of these words, of course, have their disciplines and their areas of academe and science and all the rest of it. And there's a huge amount of very important work being done in each of these words. But the argument for us is that from a framing point of view, those individual disciplines are not food system science. They're sciences that contribute to food systems. But food system science is the science of the whole. So that was a framing issue. And then noting in the Foster project, the sister project, the plurality, that there are different knowledges. There's the academic knowledge, the sort of orthodox knowledge that many of us, subscribe to and are part of. But then there's all sorts of other knowledge out there, largely put as in the realm of the citizen science. Always, knowledge about how you get things done, which is a very different approach. So we had to recognize that. So we came up with a redraft at the bottom here. Food system science weaves together knowledges on the dynamic relationships, including feedbacks between food system drivers, core activities and outcomes. Why? To study and foster transformative action on innovation, conservation, restoration, ex-innovation in these interconnected systems. Why? For transitioning towards more sustainable food systems. So that's the current language. Now, for debate. And again, are there any clarification questions about the language? The debate about the language is about to happen. So, any clarification?
What does it mean, actually?
Well, thank you for asking that, because I was waiting for somebody to ask that. We're all familiar with the phrase innovation. Ex-innovation simply means analyzing what you've got and getting rid of the stuff that's no longer relevant. Now, this is something that's very challenging in the policy community, because there's a huge amount of political capital invested in policies, a lot of personal capital sometimes. But I was at a meeting in the Commission on a panel, and I did put my head on the block, and I said, what we really need is strong ex-innovation in the policy cupboard. You could have heard a pin drop. Anyway, I'm still alive.
Why are the words conservation and restoration there? Are they specifically for ecological systems, or is there also restoration of human social systems?
Well, I would say the latter. I mean, it doesn't say only ecological. Tom, do you want to just shout a response to that, or shall we wait till after?
Let's wait.
Okay, well, let's wait, but it's noted.
They're meant to be as broad as possible.
Yeah, they are meant to be inclusive words. Anyway, so that's where that's got to. Now, when it comes to the charge that we're asking for your help now, we're running a little bit late, but I don't think it matters. We're inviting you to go into one of 3 breakout rooms. Roger, there's lists on the door of who we're inviting to which room. I don't know whether people have had a chance to look at that, but let's spend a few moments. And the idea is that we all go into one of these rooms, and there are 4 tables in each, and that we're asking you to sit at a particular table, because we've tried as best as our knowledge is to mix up disciplines and institutions and things like that. Discuss the conceptual framework. There's a big picture of it on the table, and there's little sticky things, and you can change it, you can add words, you can do what you like to it. But then after about 20 minutes or so working at the table, 30 minutes, we're going to ask those a clustering exercise for the room. So there were 4 tables in the room, but we want to end up with a single sort of comment from the room. So there's going to be a method to do that. And then once we've done that, we're then going to move over to debating the definition in much the same way. The big picture of it, lots of examples of it, you can scribble all over it. But again, we want to then cluster some key points from each table so that we can come back with a comment from the room. Then we will go into a plenary. So you need to agree up to 5 key points from the room for each of these, the diagram and for the wording. And then when we come back after tea in plenary, back in this room, we will just have a very quick report on what the 5 points are from each room, and we'll see where there is overlap. And then this evening, a few of us lucky people will be charged with trying to come up with a new set of words, which is going to satisfy most of us. Okay, folks, well, that's where we've got to. Yes, please.
So I know I'm running late, but could you just say 1 minute about the method that you used to get to this point and what disciplines have been involved so far?
To get to which point?
To the two products that you've
the two
and the framework. Who has done that?
Okay, that's a very good question. Essentially, they've both emerged through discussions within the FoSSNet project, when the project's got a lot of people involved.
Yeah.
So that was a workshop, a discussion. Everybody brings their knowledge. You know as well as anybody all the different diagrams and things are floating around out there. What's useful for delivering this project? And it's worth noting that given this enormous range of food system diagrams, that they were all designed for a job. And you can't just borrow one and assume it's going to be good for another function. And so it's really important to recognize what we've designed is meant to guide the FoSSNet project. And it evolved through a huge number of discussions. Good. Okay, folks. Are we ready to have a crack at it? So I invite you please to go back along, find whichever room you're asked to sit in, find whichever table you're asked to sit at, and we'll see you back here after tea.
Hello, everybody. Hello, everybody. Now, what we're going to try and do is briefly summarize what came out of those working groups. The group I was in was really, really good. Not because I was there, but because everybody else was there. And it was really helpful because it was exactly what we wanted. I put my head into the other groups and the same level of activity, and so that's really good. I hope what we've done is to capture it in some form that you will recognize. It's all 2 rooms are bunched on here. Tom, have you got a talk for your room?
Yes.
Just to plug it in when you're ready.
Yes.
Okay. Well, in a moment, let's talk through the other 2. Can you see that? I think there are some people online still. I'm not sure if they are, but if they're there, that's hopefully they can see the screen. This is, I think this was your group.
Yeah.
But you want to just rattle through these points?
Yes. So what we just did at Coffee, we just tried to bring the points together in each group that we had on the summary sheet, so to say. Again, we collected all the input that we got from you, but these are the summary points that we had discussed in the group, and this is again a summary of the summary points. So that's how we heard it. But we are totally happy if somebody says, "Oh, this point is captured wrongly." This is like a 2-minute summary we did over Coffee, and there will be more coming out in the meeting report where we're probably going to see more input. Anyhow, so this was from room 3.
Just need to speak
some of the points. So there was the whole question of how do we show the value chain? It's now very linear, but of course this is not how it works. And we need a different representation to show the interactions, maybe in a more circular or square or some kind of way. The whole question of health was maybe not, was kind of missing in the way of how we represented both human health outcomes of the system, but also the interaction with planetary health, with kind of animal health. So how do we represent health in the framework? The question of scale, both geographical and temporal and nested systems. That do we need to show that actually, a local food system is nested in a national one, is nested in a global, and needs that part of the representation, and how do we show that? Another big question then, how do we, this should be values, not values and mindsets. How do we show that in the representation? How do we differentiate better between drivers' outcomes and the interdependence of different outcomes on each other? So the environmental outcome, of course, interacts with the health outcome of people of the food system. The question of resilience. Is resilience an outcome of the system? Is it a characteristic of the system? Is this something that we want to include in here in the representation? We had the issue of the energy system being, of course, to a certain extent also part of the food system. You might think of biofuels. You might think of the importance of energy prices as a key driver of a lot of decisions taken in the system. So how do we deal with that? Maybe the way of how the box in the middle is, that needs to be shifted, needs to be shaped, needs to move, and then different versions needed for different purposes. So we had this thing that is this kind of the representation, and we were saying, no, this is not the representation of the food system, but for the purpose of the project, this is our starting point of how, when we internally think about what's the food system, or we work with stakeholders, here, so to say, the starting point that of course then probably needs to be adapted for other purposes, teaching versus outreach and so on and so forth. But so how do we deal with that? We probably need different ways and version of representing the system. So that's from my group, the big points that we had on our summary sheet. Again, there's a lot of detail to it. But maybe, John, you want to go? So this is just on the framework. We're not talking yet about the science definition.
Again, more on the framework. So we haven't had a chance to integrate these, but essentially similar talk. More circularity needed, deemed to be too linear. Nice point that some cultures read right to left. That's maybe the point of having arrows going both directions, so it doesn't really matter. Circular. Oh, hang on a minute. This is going to help. Yes, the circularity, how do we really capture that? You can see this debate about when does a driver become an outcome and when is an outcome and all that sort of stuff, which is the feature of the system, of course. Thresholds. And then again, should we turn the whole thing round and start with, what do we eat and where does it come from, which is reversing the diagram in effect. The big debate about whether the outcomes should be more normative, i.e. do we want better health outcomes? At the moment, the diagram just said status, and that was purposeful, so that it wasn't being normative. But that's a debate, whether that should be included. Some relational viewpoints needed. Think about the interactions, how those circles interact more effectively with the drivers. Should there be more agricultural sentiment captured in it? Then here's an interesting point about the whole framing of the thing. Are we framing it as food as a commodity or food as a right? And depending on how you do that, you'd have very different words on the outcomes and to some degree on the drivers. So do we need to have enough words so it can be read as a commodity and a right? Food choice architecture. There was the sentiment in the diagram, you remember, of the food environment growing as you go from the left to the right. Is that a satisfactory way of representing that? Again, if you have the whole thing on consumption centric as opposed to the normal supply chain, that could come out. And then just a note that the whole environmental sustainability should be much more central. That was a comment, whether or not we agree. So basically we had those points. There is some commonality. We can synthesize that a little bit more this evening, but I think collectively there were quite a lot of good points. Tom, are you in a position to talk about the conceptual framework now, and then we'll all talk about the definition?
Yes.
Any immediate reaction while Tom's coming? Yes, please.
May I just add one thing, because it was not raised in the room and not raised here. The animals.
Okay.
Were missing from the framework, either as in the energetics part. No, but animals as such, as living beings,
right?
As actors.
Mm-hmm. So animal welfare or animals as entities.
As such.
Yeah. Okay. It's all right. And how is that best done? Capture them in.
Can be an outcome.
So the outcome would be what?
Maybe animal welfare.
Oh, exactly. Yeah.
Health.
So exactly. Yeah, that's one of the outcomes that we think about, and that's a good point. So we should add that. Yeah.
The point about commodity versus right depends on your perspective.
Of course.
So for finances, it's a commodity. It's just that ultra processed foods is just a vehicle that makes lots of money. But for us, in many parts of the world, well, for everyone, food is a right. But that becomes more important in some parts of the world. It's less available. So it's an and, but it's not an and for everyone.
I thought it was an interesting point raised. Is it a commodity? Do we view it as a commodity in this diagram, or do you use a diagram viewing it as a commodity, or do you use a diagram to view it as a right?
Well, if you want to understand the problems of the system, you have to understand it as a commodity, because that's how commerce deals with it.
That's the commerce side, yeah. And I think that was the message we were getting. It's what's the shareholder take on all of this sort of thing from a mega corporation point of view. General sentiment was there's some words missing, but the other sort of main point is it structured right? Should it be much more circular in itself so that the supply chain is more of a loop? And I don't here and now know how to do that with a pencil and a piece of paper, but there must be some way of capturing that circularity better. Yeah, so that would be a good thing.
I mean, a star shape instead. So that you can the point being that then you can have cross interactions, for example, between primary production and consumers. There are direct interactions in your current model. consumers and primary producers are only connected through processors and retail, which is not.
It's not always true, but it's mostly true. And again, it's a question of should the diagram try and explain sort of 90% of what's going on and accept it's not going to be 100%. I mean, if I eat an apple off the tree in my garden, it hasn't gone through a processor or anything. So, you know, that is an example of where the diagram is wrong. But then that's a very minor component of what's going on globally.
Well, that's actually questionable, isn't it? Because, I mean, there is plenty of arguments that say that up to 70% of the world population are not fully fed by the industrial food system. So I actually think globally, that's a question. I think in Europe, fair enough, that the industrial food system
Sure. I agree with you. I agree with you. But nonetheless, globally, almost everybody or all, wherever you are, that set of activities is happening. But it's happening in different ways at different intensities. I mean, if you just dig cassava out of the ground, you grate it, you squeeze it, you grill it, you sell it. You might do it in a very low-key way, but nonetheless, it's the same set of activities. So I think that the basic diagram activities are valid everywhere. Yeah.
I think some of the images were kind of like really provoking this more kind of like industrialized way of thinking about agriculture. Like if we look at the images that we have had a trolley from the supermarket.
Sure, agreed.
So maybe there's something to do around that.
Agreed. Yeah. Anna, you come and draw something that you think represents it. But I mean, you know, transport around the. Oh, let's not forget, FoSSNet is about Europe. All right, that's I think something we can say. All right. Yeah.
So it's just an observation because I'm relatively new to food systems, although I'm a complex systems person, and it is really striking how different food systems representations are to other complex systems problems, which would tend to be much more interconnected, circular outcomes are also drivers, whereas you always see this kind of industrial sort of chain down the middle of the food system. So it's, and it does frame everything.
Sure.
I mean, I don't know, it's just interesting to see when I do the transport system, when I do the energy system, it doesn't look
quite like that.
Linear form.
No, that's true.
The only arena that I really see that.
I mean,
I find that quite interesting.
But part of it might be history because
sure
originally it was,
obviously.
as Eric was saying, it's the linear value chain that the whole system's
No, clearly it is historical, but it's sort of what was that?
Yeah, exactly. No, I agree totally.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So it might be an interesting experiment to try it.
Yeah.
Yes, but I mean, food as a commodity is a material that flows. I was thinking of the energy system.
Yeah.
And you generate it, you transport it, either as petrol or an electric wire. You literally transform it, excuse the pun, and then you use it, you consume it. So again, you've got basically similar set of activities: production, transport,
It
consumption.
depends whether you want to emphasize this as a complex adaptive system or an industrial system.
Agreed. Anyway,
representation
but I'd just pick you up that not all food system diagrams have those words in, and certainly not all of them are linear. There are many circular ones, as we know. Tom, how's the novel coming on?
Just starting with the introduction.
Very good. Okay.
Shall I come on? Yeah.
Well, why not? And then we'll come back to the definition, because there's going to be similar discussions on that.
All right.
I should plug in somewhere.
Yeah.
That's good. Don't know what's happening now. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So this is a graphic novel. Actually, the very nice discussions in the room, and happy to report that we made good progress in our discussions. When it comes to the framework diagram, our main point in the room was that
what is the purpose of this specific diagram? And don't think that any diagram can capture all purposes. And also, if with that knowledge in mind, it might be easiest to simplify the diagram a lot, get rid of a lot of the words, and sort of have a skeleton that will then be applied according to context. Okay. That's the first thing. When it comes to the food system science definition, I think two words come to mind. The first is that this is obviously under construction. We've just started thinking about this definition of food system science, and everybody agreed in the room that it would be good to have one. It's in a way also a little bit the surprise, like, oh, why don't we have one? So let's develop one, but then let's improve a bit, because what we currently have actually reads a little bit like a project mission statement, right? So this is where we want food system science to lead us, maybe, more than a bit of a distant definition of a science field, which should maybe be a little bit less normative. Okay, so we'll come to that. So a little bit more detail on the framework. So clarify what is the purpose of the framework, and then boundary setting seems to be a really important key purpose. For that, you don't need this very extensive wording, but also that is in itself an argument against fine-tuning, because if you then go into using too many words, it sounds as if you're going to be complete, but in fact you're not, right? So then the second is that using the presentation, the argument of Erik earlier today, the backbone. We don't want lists. It's too linear, it's too simplistic. It might be based on a material flow, whereas in the room, we felt that actually the actors and the actor relations and the different layers in their relations are the core of the food system. That then also means that there is more attention to power dynamics, which might show directly into the framework. The whole depiction doesn't look systemic enough, so it doesn't show what other people mentioned, circular. I think this circular means feedback, right? It's the feedback loops that actually make us think about the system. The interconnection from outcomes back into drivers and activities, and maybe the whole logic of thinking in terms of drivers, outcomes, or drivers, activities, and outcomes is in itself not conducive to systems logic, because it's linear, right? So it can be improved, work in progress. And then I think two combined statements is that the framework currently doesn't have that normative work, that the system is failing in terms of exceeding beyond the planetary boundaries, not providing sufficient of social needs related to food. So can that be representing in the food systems framework? And probably connected to that is the time scale. Currently, our outcomes are all on one similar time scale, when we know that there is a huge discrepancy between short-term and long-term outcomes, and that in itself provides feedbacks. Right. How much time do I have, actually? This is my methodology. Humaira captured all the points from the plenary wrap-up. We used half an hour for that, and then I singled out the ones that need mentioning in this presentation very shortly, beyond the general points. So first of all, this point on using drivers as exogenous, this linear, it obscures the power dynamic. Our externalities need to be missing. Perhaps think about pressures and responses as an alternative frame. The food environment, the way it's depicted, most people were not happy with it, including yourself, I think, because it was sort of an add-on, but it's... Then the whole political economy of food seems to be not well represented. Governance is not mentioned, is mentioned, but it's not seen to be a feedback. And there was a comment that maybe it's too abstract. Where's the human factor in all this? And then in terms of outcomes, particularly health seems to be missing, and food nutrition security doesn't cover all that. Okay, moving on to the definition. A key point here, like I already said, like it's, what were my main points? It was the mission statement, and that it's work in progress. Okay, so this normative element is of course related to the mission statement. How do I report this? Okay, so any case, I think it's obvious from the definition. No, let me take it one step back. I think generally it was agreed that having a definition would be really useful. Having a normative in the definition could also be a good thing, particularly if we use this for coming together in a specific way. But the main thing of the definition is already that it suggests a certain normative element on how to do these types of studies, including being transdisciplinary and other elements. So, okay, moving to the second point, or the third point, it's too long, as is my presentation. It's too complicated, likewise. And I think that's a good point. So again, simplifying to the sort of the bare bone of what food system science could be is actually more helpful than having all these layers of understanding, studying, to get something in action, and then to do a system level impact. So make it shorter and make it crisp. Also, because we might need to move away from this definition and quickly start to talk about the principles for doing food system science in a way that we think is helpful for the science field and for impact. And then there was a question, this weaving, which to my surprise was not really targeted. I thought it was something that would sort of be eliminated in point number 1, but it's still there, except that we don't really know who weaves. And that might also be more clarified. We also have a solution where a possible definition is that food system science, this was not endorsed by the group, by the way, but aims at a transdisciplinary and transformative approach to food systems transition towards sustainability. Lots of discussion whether such container words should be in the definition, but still, here it is. And then as a methodology, we are the weaving community. So we should adopt the bird probably as our emblem and move on. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Emerging.
Over to you.
Thank you. Okay, well that was good, Tom, because you went straight into the definition. So we'll add our definition notes. We should hopefully appear in a moment. So there were some sort of fundamental issues. The first one I really captured is this FoSSNet's definition of what we think is food system science, or is it our attempt to define food system science for anybody and everything? So that's a boundary issue, and that's related to the purpose. Are we using it purely for the project, or are we trying to put out there a wholly new understanding?
Is there nothing in between the two?
Yeah, possibly. I don't know, but that was the question. Let's come back to your point. Then we went on to this notion of different values and different actors, and how we can use the definition to tease apart the values and who wants what. Then we get into this. The last few words in it, if you remember, were a purpose statement, which is a bit like the mission statement, to help deliver more sustainable food systems, or forget the actual words. But it wrapped together the notion of what we're trying to define it as, with what we want to use it, why we're using it, and that created a bit of complication. We'll come to that in a minute. Some details, science was perhaps the wrong word, because often people think it only means natural science. Use One Health instead of sustainable food system, because it brings in another notion that's in the literature now. Separating the what from the why. And one idea was to have a very clear statement of what we define it as, and then underneath
a set of words as to why we have done it and what we're intending to use it for. So if we want to be clear as to what we mean by food system science, we shouldn't be including the purpose of food system science. That's the discussion. Explanation of what actually sustainable, sorry, that's garbled. What is actually sustainable? What are we actually trying to make sustainable is what I think he's trying to say. Then we had some notion of a bundle of words. This is sort of wordsmithing stuff, frankly. That is, there was a bundle of words which could just be condensed to socio-ecological, as an example. And then we got just some of these general points of separate the why from the what from the why. Always look at the definition in relation to the conceptual framework. And if you look at them separately, it's not as useful as if you look at them together, because they kind of help explain each other. So that was a point. Is it to define food system science or what is needed for food system thinking? And I thought that was a really valuable contribution. I'll just give you our example. I think the one I remember is about somebody who developed, was it the pesticide people? Let's go with the carrot example, because I remember that. The other one was more of a stick. Somebody invents a new carrot cultivar, and that can be a really tight piece of natural agricultural plant physiological science. Boom, fine. If that person develops the carrot cultivar saying,